Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. My name is Matthew. I'm your host. I'm joined by Riki Hayashi, my co-host. And today we're asking the question, what happens after we win? There's a favorite YouTuber that I really love who did a whole thing about Disney after Ever After. And he was sort of saying, like, why is it that all love stories end, after love's first kiss or after they get married? And they never really show what comes next. And Riki and I have found that on a number of recent episodes, we've been asking similar questions about, hero movies. Like the villain's been overthrown, the kingdom has been overthrown, the emperor, whatever it is. There's a chance now for something new, and that's where the movie ends. And we rarely get to see what would actually happen next. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. And we'll be using a number of different examples. The comments are open if people, as they kind of want to come in and jump in, please do so if you're watching this live. And for everyone else, as always, please send us questions and thoughts and feedback as we go. But Riki, let me just start by kind of asking you in general, what are examples you can think of where you've always kind of wondered, okay, well, we know what happened to the old, but what happened next?
Yeah, I'd really love to know what happens after the end of The Last Jedi. It's too bad we never got a sequel to that movie.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just kidding.
Yeah, not quite the situation we're talking about, but yes, I understand what you mean.
Gosh, so let's see. We win, and then we ask what happens after.
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you have something?
Okay, let me start that intro again.
I have a lot of examples of follow-ups that I enjoy, so
It's okay. So, Riki, let me start us off by asking, in kind of a general sense, why does this matter? Like, it's fun to watch our hero, take down the evil king or destroy the evil corporation or government. Why does what happens next matter?
well, I think it matters because after you overthrow evil, I'm just going to generally say evil, right?
Yeah.
You have to ask yourself who's next in terms of like evil. And I think that's where things can get interesting if you want to write those stories. Because a lot of the times it leads to self-reflection about the people who won and what their goals actually are and what evil means now in this different context.
Yep.
Perhaps.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I can see that in two ways, because I think it can be, okay, well, we just overthrew this bad thing and we've got to be careful that we don't become bad ourselves. But also, when your whole structure has been, we are here to fight evil, if you don't have evil, you start trying to go and find it. Like, and I think in our own world, this has certainly happened many times of, when you're all set up based on like, we're the good guys, well, now we've got to go find a bad guy. And that can quickly become, oh, anybody who is stopping us from doing the good things becomes the bad guy, or et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and I think it's also important that when you are opposed, that you can't just be opposed to like, and this applies not just to fiction, but to like real life political situations. You cannot just solely be opposed to something. You have to stand for something yourself.
Yeah.
And that should be clear in the narrative for there to be a follow-up. So you can't just be opposed to tyranny, but you have to champion democracy, right? And equal rights. And then that will lead to a story where now, if you are established as the government, how do you uphold those things that you stood for during the fight?
Right.
And sometimes it's there's stories of compromise and trying to figure out what it means, because it's going to mean different things to different people. Like a lot of the times, like an oppositional story is about a coalition of everyone who opposes a thing, and many of them will share goals, but some may have different goals. And then after you win, it's like, well, we agree on this one central thing, like no tyranny, but about the democracy, like do we want an absolute democracy, right, where
Right.
one vote per person, or do we want representational democracy, with states, provinces, whatever they are, and representatives, etc. So it's like that's a very like real example, right?
Yeah.
When you mentioned this topic to me, and you're like, well, what are the stories where this happens? I was like, well, Hamilton, right, the play, which is based on roughly based on quote unquote real history. There's some interesting exaggerations, but the fundamental story of the American Revolution and after they defeat the British Empire and gain independence, there's still a lot of interesting stories and characters there about how they create a new nation. Because it's not just like you defeat the British Empire and then like new nation, we're good.
Right.
There's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah.
And I think that like the fictional side of it, some of that maybe doesn't play well in fiction, right? Because it's a lot of meetings, and we know how like especially Star Wars fans feel about these political meetings. And maybe that's why Hamilton had to be a musical for it to be interesting.
Yeah. No, I think there's a lot of truth there. And kind of just starting with the point you're making about the coalitions, I have a lot of problems with Orson Scott Card, and some of his later books brings a lot more of the politics that I disagree with into them, that I don't love. But one thing that I thought was really well done in his books was this idea that, this great human federation that came together in order to fight their enemy starts to fall apart, like when they're just starting to sense victory is near, not even when it has already happened. And I think that becomes a really interesting part of the story. And I think, though, that what you ended with is really kind of the key here. The media we get, especially if it's like superhero based or, action movie or that kind of thing, is really based around it's based around, a fight, a confrontation. And for a confrontation, you have to have someone the audience roots for and someone they're rooting against. And that's the switch. And I think it's part of why I think often a lot of times this topic is discussed in books or things like that, because it's you're right. It's really hard to tell a story. Although, I mean, I think I would love it. You would love it, but maybe not as many folks. And Hollywood certainly thinks that it can't, because the idea of the mid-range movie has just disappeared. It's all now either the huge budget or indies. But just this idea of let's actually talk. Let's figure out compromise. Because to me, there's so many interesting and hard questions you have to talk about after we've won that I just wish we got to see more of in these stories.
Yeah, I mean, I love Gundam. And the most interesting thing to me about Gundam is that the supposed good guys, I think the organization translation is United Earth Federation. They are usually the protagonists that have the Gundam, which is like the good guy robot. And yet, like throughout the stories, there's a very consistent narrative of like, are we the baddies? Like, is the Federation good? It's like, no. Like in some, they're just outright the villains of the story. But fundamentally, it's a story about colonialism, not like conquering colonialism, but literally like humans colonizing space and then being controlled from Earth, and the colonies wanting some autonomy. And as the central government, the Federation is the baddie, right? And that, and it's so fascinating how they weave those stories, because it's still often, like I said, that the Gundam is the protagonist, like the pilot of the Gundam is the protagonist, and the bad guys, like you fight the bad guys, and yet it asks these like very interesting questions. So I think that like, and that's a weird thing. Like after we've won is like the fundamental question here. What next? Is that they keep winning, the Gundams keep winning, and yet the problem still persists because it's the good guys are the bad guys, or however you want to put it.
Yeah, I mean, the power corrupts, or all these things. I think I'm so glad you mentioned Hamilton, because I think in many ways, sort of the slogan of this entire, topic is, winning is easy, governing is harder. I think, whatever the exact line is in the musical. I'm embarrassing myself for getting the exact wording wrong. But that's where I think we kind of go. And so let's talk about some of those specific questions. And here we're going to start bringing up examples of things we think either, do it well or don't do it well, or that we would have liked to know more about. Because I think one of the first questions is always, what do you do with the people you've defeated? And a lot of the time, let's kind of assume that we're taking something like the Empire in Star Wars, or, the Fire Nation or something like that, where you have a leader and maybe a coterie of people around them who have, these very specific, very horrible, we want to rule, we want to have all the control and power ideas. But then under them, you have the whole, thousands, millions of people, some of whom may have agreed with this, some of whom may have, taken the we're just following orders idea, some of whom may have taken the look, they're going to kill me and my family if I don't, jump into this TIE fighter and fly it. Or many of whom have just been propagandized and told, like, we need a stable, healthy world, and the Avatar is going to, ruin all that. What do we do with those people?
You kill them. Like, I said it to be funny, but like historically, and here's the thing: like, I am morally opposed to the death penalty, especially like as a criminal justice measure, like in terms of like societies. But on the grand scale, when you're talking about conflict between nations and war crimes, often resulting in deaths of millions of people, or even like thousands, right? Like war crimes like are bad. And as opposed as I am to the death penalty, from a historical standpoint, I think you have to kill like a certain number of people responsible for war crimes.
Wow.
Because you have to stop people from doing that. It's a punitive measure, right? You have to say, you can't do this. That's bad. And it's not working out that way, but hopefully like future leaders like, oh, well, maybe we shouldn't do war crimes. Right? Like, I don't know. I'm very conflicted about death penalty issues, but as a historian, like, how do you not do this, I guess, is the question. And like incarceration for life obviously is an option, but the way things are structured now, there's issues of like martyrdom, potentially like rebels who try to free that prisoner and continue a fight on with them, or as martyrs, right? Like so that's why like I'm very conflicted.
I'm sorry, hold on 1 second. I got an emergency thing from home.
Yeah.
That's interesting, and that I admit that's a direction I never thought we'd go. I will say I don't want this to become the whole focus of the discussion. I am completely and in all ways opposed to the death penalty, so I'd very much disagree with you on that. My understanding is that the statistical evidence has proven quite clearly that it does not actually serve as a deterrent. Particularly not to like, for criminals. But I think that, is also the case for war crimes and stuff like that. We've certainly seen an awful lot of war crimes ever since Nuremberg and the Japanese trials after World War II.
But I mean, I'll just say, like, statistically, I don't think there's any way to statistically prove that it's whether it's a deterrent or not for war crimes, just because luckily it's not frequent enough.
For me, as a fundamental political philosophy, I do not think any government should ever have the ability to decide who should or shouldn't live. I just think that is never a power that a government should ever get to consider having. But putting that one aside, I do agree that I do think there has to be a deterrent aspect of, yes, the fuck around and find out kind of thing of the international community or the intergalactic community, or whatever, saying like these things are wrong and they cannot be allowed. And I think, even in our own world, we're right now seeing struggles over whether, our international courts of justice can be allowed to apply those standards to war crimes as they're happening. But so, okay, let's take the world of, we talk about Star Wars all the time. Let's take the world of the Fire Nation. Let's assume we're going to have some fairly drastic penalty for the people who we designate as these are responsible for the war crimes of the Fire Nation. And, whether that's death or that's life imprisonment or some other thing. Who in the Fire Nation would you say should get that punishment? I think Ozai, definitely. Azula? The different generals? The foot soldiers? Where would you start wanting to apply that?
I don't have enough, or like we, like as an audience, don't have enough knowledge because of the narrowed scope of that story. So like when I'm talking about, like we have to kill them, like it's for in terms of a nation, it's probably a handful of people, right? Like the decision makers. I think when you get down to the people who participated in war crimes, like maybe because of there are issues of I was following orders, like life imprisonment is the correct answer in my opinion. But like if someone makes a top level nation level decision that leads to the deaths of thousands to potentially millions of people, like I think that's it. So like like Ozai is definite because as the Fire Lord, he's the one who ordered the wars to start basically, and ordered the execution of or the genocide, of the Air Nation, right at the beginning of the war. And
well,
and
no,
in terms
it was his grandfather.
Oh yeah, you're right. Sorry. Gosh, wow. Yeah, because it's 100-year war. But
right.
there were other decisions, like at some point, like to attack the Earth Nation or something like that, right? But beyond that, we don't even really know, like Iroh, what his culpability is, just because we never really see that play out in the narrative. We understand he was a general and that he led the attack on Ba Sing Se, the siege of Ba Sing Se, but we don't really understand from a historical examination perspective, like what decisions he made and what the actions that happened there resulted in. Like we get some glimpses, like the soldier who's like, my brother died, but that's just war, unfortunately. And as much as I hate it, like, people die in wars, and as warring parties, like we accept it to a certain degree, unfortunately. And so what I'm talking about is like when we talk about war crimes, it's more about like unnecessary death, like civilian death. I think is where we're getting at. So don't really know. Azula, you mentioned. I don't think there was anything specifically for her. Like she was bad. She was a bad. She was a villain, and did some things, especially personally, against the protagonist. Right. But from a nation perspective, like she conquered Ba Sing Se.
Yeah.
But that was largely through infiltration. So she executed the Earth Nation king. Was that right?
I mean, it was a kid's show. And so I think a lot of this happens sort of off camera, but I think we can assume that some people died in Ba Sing Se as a result of the actions that Azula took. But also she's a child. I guess here's where I come from on this, because you're right. I don't think it's easy to draw the line. And I think I don't want to kind of walk out of it being like here, like it's, generals and up, but colonels down are fine. It's very much case by case. And it's very much, kind of what are the general guidelines? And that's what we're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, there are tribunals for this type of thing in the real world. So like, we would need evidence is what I'm saying.
Right. I think for me, though, one of the reasons why I'm so interested in the Truth and Reconciliation councils in tribunals in South Africa, and they've been also now tried in some other places too. Northern Ireland is another place that went through a process like this, is that a lot of them are about sort of trying to stop the cycle of war, and the cycle being about like, no, we're winning, no, you're winning, no, we're winning, where everyone thinks they're the good guy and everyone thinks the other one's the bad guy. And when your side wins, you kill all the bad guys, and then when they win, they do the same back to you. And the idea of the commissions is often try to, okay, how can we heal from this? How can we move forward? And I think you're right. There still has to be some kind of penalties for, whether that's imprisonment or losing their bender status, or you can't take the force away from someone in Star Wars, but whatever it could be, for the people really at the top. But I think for me, so much of the focus has to be on how do you focus. Let me back up and say, to me, there's one other key point here is I don't think I was just following orders as an excuse ever. I think that's very clear. But I do think there's something to be said for when you are born and raised hating someone else. I am a lot more interested in how do we stop that happening to the next generation versus how do we punish the people who were acting on what they were born and raised with all their life, And I kind of think that's where, like, it's part of why I've loved some of the I think you and I have talked about it, the Star Wars novel Fallen Star, right? That's about the two pilots who one joins the Empire and one joins the rebellion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The best romance in Star Wars.
Right?
Which is sad.
And although some of the High Republic is giving it a run for its money, to be sure, one of the things I think that does so well is it shows how a person who is ignorant of a lot of things because of how they've been propagandized, and maybe is keeping their head in the sand on some things, but can still be trying to be a good moral person and wind up supporting evil. And I guess I'm really hesitant to try and wanting to jump to punish all those people, especially because, like, I look at somewhere like where Iraq, where I think this is exactly what happened. Like, one group took over and tried to punish all the others, and all the people who supported Saddam in any way were like kicked out of the government and kicked out of the army, and left completely unemployed, like down to the very lowest privates in the army. And it's a part of why there's been chaos in that country now for decades afterwards. So I guess to me, I always want to move. I want to move towards that reconciliation, and I want to say, yes, the people who are actually making the decisions need to be dealt with, and the people who are, like the prison guards at Auschwitz. What's the equivalent of that? Is that the people, the star, if the Death Star had survived, do you punish the Tarkin obviously is guilty of the destruction of Alderaan, but are the people who, press the buttons to fire the super laser? I think they are, maybe, but do they hold more responsibility than anyone else? I guess I just always want to kind of be very, very careful of going that direction.
I mean, yes, is my answer.
Mm-hmm.
And when like punish to me, again, like some form of imprisonment for the Death Star laser operator or whatever they're called. Right? Because they know what they are doing. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like, it's not just pushing a button. They understand that by pushing that button, they are operating a super weapon that destroys a planet. And presumably there's some layout on their screen that shows Alderaan or something. Like, they're not just like blindly pushing the button because they were told. So I believe that there's some accountability is needed there. I would not put those operators, I would not advocate their execution. But I think Tarkin, like it's like Palpatine, Tarkin, Vader,
right?
In terms of characters we're familiar with. And then I don't know that we are shown anyone else in the high ranks that would easily fit like war crimes.
Yeah.
I mean, we're told some stories post Empire, like Operation Cinder seems to be primed for like war crimes.
Yep,
is my understanding, and that's like the after Endor, Operation Cinder is like a Imperial mop up or like a scorched earth policy where they destroyed their own populaces to deny the fledgling New Republic resources and materials.
Right.
And like a lot of civilian populations were destroyed.
Mm-hmm. No, I think it's very true.
But like a New Hope era Star Wars, like even the generals and admirals, like had Admiral Piet survived Endor, I don't
Mm-hmm.
think we were ever shown anything that'd be like, yeah, he's a war criminal. I think he's just, yeah, like the military person following orders to some
Right.
degree, as long as the things that they do again do not cross certain lines of like
Mm-hmm.
civilian attack. I think like
Yeah.
in
Like,
combat you kill people, unfortunately, and that's like not technically a war crime. Like war is a crime, but not a war
mm-hmm.
crime, I guess.
No, I hear you. And I do think there's some level of, you know, there's always going to be the littler stuff that we're not noticing, like the little regional governors. In Avatar, every now and then they come to a town in the Earth Kingdom that's run by a particular Fire Lord person who is, particularly abusive to those people in the particular
Sure.
area they're in, or the prison guard who was just, horribly treating people and killing people and things
Yeah.
like that. And
And
yeah,
like those can be war crimes, but probably not like war crimes that would result in execution, right?
where does
In
duress
terms of
fall?
like Geneva Convention type
Hmm.
stuff.
Where does duress fall? Like for those Death Star technicians, they know that if they disobey the order, they're going to get force choked to death. Does that factor in?
No, I mean, first off, I don't know that they know that. I think they know that they would probably be uh, imprisoned,
Mm-hmm.
but the like the whole force choke thing, I think, is a very on the bridge.
Mm-hmm.
The people on the bridge of the Star Destroyers know because
Right.
they're around Vader. Some guy like Vader is basically a myth. Like at this point, the Force is a myth because
Right.
the Moff in that meeting even like
Mm-hmm.
doesn't believe it at that point
Your
until he
ancient
gets force
superstition.
choked.
Your ancient superstition that I saw people use 20 years ago. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Well, and we don't have to make it specifically about that, but I mean, just in general, how does it change our level of culpability that we think when people are doing terrible things or assisting someone do terrible things because there's the gun to their head or it's the gun to their kids' heads or something like that?
I guess like my default answer to that is it depends, and that's why there are trials.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not gonna like blanket be like, well, if they're threatening you, it's okay for you to kill.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Certainly depends on the circumstances, and I think if we do like trolley problem, like your life is worth. I cringe when I say this, but your life is worth less than I don't even know, like
Yeah.
50 million. How many people were on Alderaan? Like,
Right.
and I guess your follow up is going to be like, does it really matter? Because if you say no, the next person's going to say yes and push the button. Like, I think you still have to say no.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. Morally, I think I agree with you, and I want to believe that I would make that decision. But I think, we tell a lot of great stories about people who have trouble doing that.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
it's I'm not gonna sit here in the comfort of my home and say like, oh, easy choice, like just say
yeah.
no. Like it's obviously like a very difficult thing, and
Nancy Reagan on war crimes. Just say no.
it takes it takes courage. It takes courage to disobey orders that you do not agree with, like morally.
Yeah.
And I think that to me, like that's a good story that we can celebrate,
Yeah.
and those are fun stories to have, I think.
I think for me, what I'm really going with all this is, and not just the South Africa example, but I think it's a good demonstration of the kind of thing I'm talking about. For me, when these kind of things happen, there are individuals who are maybe responsible for this, but it's a societal crime much more than it is an individual. And like in many ways, Avatar I think is such a good example of this because as we said, like we can both get confused. I've done it as well, and think that Ozai started all this. It's not. Ozai was born into this. From the moment Ozai was born, the Fire
Yeah.
Nation has been at war with the Earth Kingdom, and that's all he's ever known. And I I think about all the places in the world where people are raised, just because for generations our people have hated their people, and so we have to fight them, and that's what we do. Or for generations, we have known that if we don't obey, we die, or we get starved, or our children are taken away from us, so we have to obey. And so I guess where I keep going is I want there to be some degree of individual responsibility, but I'm really interested more in the how do you kind of try to undo that societal teaching and hate? Because, and I think Star Wars and The Mandalorian has started to explore, and then The Bad Batch has started to explore this really well, is that when it does become, okay, we won, so we're just going to kill all you guys, all your leaders at least, it doesn't leave people wanting to join your new republic. It meets them waiting around for when the new order comes around, or the first order, whatever we're calling it these days.
So yes, I agree. Like Ozai was raised in it. And that,
Yep.
my confusion stands. But so too was Iroh raised in it.
Mm-hmm.
And as the elder brother, he was supposed to be the next Fire Lord.
Right.
Right. And something fundamentally in his person, his character, and I guess his history, he participated in the war as a general, led the siege on Ba Sing Se, but something in him broke when his son died.
Right.
And that led to his reformation, let's say. But I think the most interesting thing that could happen at the end, after the war, is for Iroh to still stand trial for things that he was responsible for as a general, and possibly still be punished, right? Like, again, I think some amount of incarceration for Iroh may be appropriate. And I think that understanding his character, he would accept that. And there might even be something where they're like, well, but because you helped later to overthrow Ozai, we're going to let you off. And be like, no, like, it's important for the healing that I still be held accountable for what I did.
Look,
I think that would be a very Iroh thing.
Someone's got to serve tea to those prisoners, and he would set up the tea dispensary in the prison. Yeah, I mean, he is a man of such talent. So that's the kind of thing where I'd want it to be more about like some kind of compulsory service to the community, but one that Iroh would happily do. But yeah, I think, and we can joke about the tea and all that, but I think you're right. Yeah, like, to me, it's the same reason why I think you may have been the one to say this. Someone on my podcast kind of said that the best answer to the whole, like, was Anakin redeemed, is Anakin found some degree of redemption as a father to Luke, and maybe a little to Leia. He absolutely did not get any redemption in terms of what he did to the Jedi or to the galaxy at large. And if he had lived, I think a lot of people have been like, "I'm so glad you came back to the good side. Now we need to talk about a trial." Something like that.
And I think, like, when you're talking about the reconciliation, it has to come from both sides, and that's why I focused on this Iroh story, because it shouldn't just be about the winners forgiving, but it should be about the losers, like, understanding their culpability and admitting their responsibility for what happened, and me kind of meeting in the middle, I think, is the best course of action for that case.
And probably some work, I think the assumption often is, well, we won, so we didn't commit any war crimes. If there was some kind of war crimes tribunal, I would want it to include, Ozai and maybe Iroh, but also the head of the Dai Li, who had done all these things in Ba Sing Se to screw everything up. And other people like the Dai Li, that's the name of it, right? The secret society that propagandizes the whole idea of there's no war in Ba Sing Se and all that. And I'll just add I kind of made a small comment there about the community service thing. For me, at least, I think, Ricky, you're on similar pages. Part of why this is a hard discussion is because I think we both recognize that there are massive problems with our modern clerical system of, punishment for crime and things like that. And that I think we both want to see a system of the response to bad actions being a lot better than just, lock them in a box for a certain amount of time. But yeah, that there's some validity to whatever better way a society can come up with for dealing with, bad actors, war criminals are definitely on that list of bad actors.
Yeah, I think you and I probably have similar feelings about like criminal justice and incarceration in terms of civil society.
Hmm.
But like on a scale of nations, on a scale of war, it becomes like so difficult to compare. Okay, like you're put on trial and you're incarcerated for marijuana possession versus acts of war are very different things. So it's
Yeah.
like I and then like the fiction of it, right? Like it's always very difficult to try to frame war in fiction versus war in real life. And
I think that's true.
that's why we're here, because
Yeah.
we're asking these questions of our
Hmm.
favorite shows and whatnot.
Yeah.
But the more I talk about it, I love this Iroh idea. Give us that. Give us the
Yeah.
post-war Iroh trial, because he's such a good character, and I think like
Hmm.
something like that would bring out the best aspects that we love about him.
Hmm. Well, and especially because my memory of the South African stuff, and I did some more digging into it now, and I can't remember specific names, but I know that there were some members of the apartheid regime who, like I said, they decided not to criminalize people, but they made a point of saying, I'm going to sort of, self punish myself, of saying that I'm going to dedicate the rest of my life to talking to fellow people in the apartheid era about why
Mm,
we were wrong and how we should do better. And like, you know, I can imagine Iro standing up in front of the judge and saying, Judge, how about if I spend the rest of my life talking to other people of the Fire Nation about why we were wrong and we have to like find better ways to live in peace? And any
yeah,
judge who's like, no, I want to put you in a box for 10 years is a complete idiot? Because I think that's the other key thing is that on some level you have to win people over to whatever's going to come next and recognize that the foot soldiers are not evil. The people in the people who are pushing papers, they're not all doing it because they have these terrible things in their heart. They're doing it because they're propagandized, because they've been lied to, because they're afraid. And some of that might be for good or bad reasons, and you might have moral judgments against them, and that's fine. But it's not just easy as we'll just punish a third of the population or whatever it is. Collaborators, I think, is one of the words you'll hear all the time.
mhm.
I
Yeah,
think
I
it's
think your point, and that's why like you have to have a trial. You have to like
mhm.
understand the human being on trial and like
Yeah.
what they actually did and how they feel about it now. Like that should definitely all be taken into consideration. And I think Iroh is a very good but also extreme example of someone who, through the narrative of the story, we understand is just like a really good person.
Mhm.
And that makes it a lot easier for us as an audience to go, oh, but he shouldn't be executed. He shouldn't be like incarcerated. Yeah, just like let him
Yeah.
have his tea shop.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
yeah, your thing about like using his voice to heal the Fire Nation is a good one. I think
Yeah.
like having him go back to Ba Sing Se and apologizing and talking to
Mhm.
people there like is a good move for him. So like
Yeah.
there's a lot of ways that could go.
So this is clearly a topic we could talk about for many, many episodes, but I want to shift to I think what is the other side of this coin. Like there's a lot of different points. We'll probably do more on this topic. But the other big thing I think we've been talking about is what do the heroes do next, especially in terms of who takes over,
They become the villains, right?
right?
Like this is
Well, I know that's a theme you've seen in a lot of the anime and stuff you're talking about. You want to give a little bit, and we'll go into that in more specifics later, but in a different episode. But you want to give like a little idea of what you're talking about there?
well, I mentioned Gundam, where they like the good guy, the Federation has always kind of been in the villains in the
Hmm.
background, but it is also just like unless unless the enemy is just like so alien that it doesn't matter. Like if you're talking about like human versus human conflict, it is very often the case that the good guys who win and beat the bad guy humans then if there is like a sequel or something, like they become the bad guys, and like for whatever reason, some other organization has to rise up and fight them,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because I think it's just like if you want to keep telling the story, you have to have a bad guy, and it's like, well, who's going to be the bad guy now?
Right.
And it can be, I think, like there are different variations of the narrative. Like some are that the good guys win, but if it's like a internal nation, if it's like one nation, you
Mm-hmm.
still have to kind of absorb enough of the bad guys into your new
Right.
government and your new structure. Like this is the Star Wars thing, is that the Empire fell, but the New Republic still for a while was the capital was in Coruscant, I think, or maybe that
Mm-hmm.
was Legends. But still, like a lot of the imperial bureaucracy had to carry over because it's a bureaucracy. It's a huge galaxy, and you're like, well, we still need people to do jobs,
Right.
and also the Empire was a continuation of the old Republic, and as fundamentally as like it was a rebellion to restore the Republic, there were still like a lot of people in the Empire who were like old
Mm-hmm.
Republicans.
Yeah. And some of them were separatists, you know, who with whatever war crimes they've committed all the way back then.
Yeah.
I think that's really true. And I think that kind of gets to a lot of what we were talking about in that first part of why I think for me, and this actually goes back to the thing you were saying at the very beginning, you know, the question has to be raised, why are you fighting? Are you fighting because you don't like the people who are hurting everyone else, the people who have, you know, maybe they hurt people in your family as well, maybe they, you know, oppressed you in some way, they oppressed your group of people, your tribe, your nation, whatever it is, and you want to get them? Or is it because you want things to be better in some way? And like I don't think it's a I think most people have some degree of both, but I think where so many people get into trouble in our own world, and I imagine as well in this one, is when it's not, I am so angry at the people who are oppressing, you know, um, that when I get in power, how much of my punishment of them is because I think that the society is going to be better if I do, and how much because it's that I'm angry that they, you know, killed my people and I want revenge or I want. I've spoken on it at length before, and I won't go into it too much. But you know, it's part of why I love V for Vendetta so much because I think V understands that he is motivated by his desire to hurt all the people who helped create this evil regime, and so he shouldn't be a part of deciding what happens to the regime after they fall. You know, and I think that's where it's where again I think that it's a hard story to tell because it's not as interesting, but I'd love to see more stories about how do you wrestle with finding that line between the incredibly legitimate anger and fear people have of the group they just defeated without letting that be we're just going to be just as acting on anger and fear as the last people.
Yeah, and you have a subset of your group that is fighters who are
Right.
like there to fight. And in theory, when the fight is over, some of them don't want to stop fighting because that's like all they
Yeah.
know. That's what they've gotten used to. That's what they like. Some of them, like they enjoy it.
Mm-hmm.
And so they look for someone new to fight, and it's like, well, I guess it's you, and it's the people who just took over. Like the thing that comes to my mind when I just said that is the Hunger Games.
Yeah.
Kind of the most absurd, like immediate reversal of that. Of like, well, I guess I'll just kill you then, new president.
Yeah.
I think is what happens.
And I'll kill your children. I'm going to kill the children of the people who did this because they killed our children.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was trying to think of it because I didn't want us to just talk about Avatar and Star Wars, but I think you're right. The Hunger Games is a great example of that, and that's why, in many ways, I think what Katniss does there is so important because, you know, what everyone wants to do is to put the victors in charge, and all of them have this incredible anger, and that's where this idea comes from of let's do these terrible things to the children of Snow, and it's just repeating the cycle, and what she does by killing President Coin instead of Snow. I mean, Snow winds up dying as well, and probably, deserved a terrible fate if I'm against the death penalty, though. But still, it breaks the cycle and gets people to realize, wait a minute, no, if we're just trying to show that we hate the last group, we're no better.
Mhm.
What are examples of stories that you think have done this well, of have shown us some of? Oh wait, hold on a second. Did you say you couldn't think of ones that have done it well, or you couldn't think of ones that hadn't done it well?
Well, like I think one we started kind of with like it doesn't get told,
Yeah.
but I think like there have been enough where it gets told.
Okay, so let me ask it that way. So, what are some stories where you think this does get told, and where you're interested in the questions it raised, or you kind of use as examples of like that? That's one that I really liked.
So I haven't watched the TV show, but the Foundation, Isaac Asimov's Foundation, is like
Mm.
literally about the fall of an empire
Oh,
and
that's cool.
how you rebuild it. It's weird because it's a story that span like hundreds of years. I don't remember exactly,
Hmm.
but it's told in obviously like different novels, and each novel I think is often like 100 years after the last one. So it's not like a straight through narrative of like this is
Hmm.
what happens, because it's based on history. It's based on the rise and fall of the Roman Empire.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. I have never read those. I tried to read those books in eighth grade, and they were just way above me. And I'll probably try them again at some point, though. And I definitely do want to check out the TV series.
I I've been told it's not worth my time. You
Okay,
know,
that's fair.
whether it's worth my time or not is like debatable, but that it's not, I don't know, true to the books, I guess. Because again, like I think the books uh is one of those like unfilmable things, just from
Hmm.
a timeline perspective.
That's fair. That's fair.
Um, but yeah, it and it's so Foundation is so different in my opinion from a lot of these other narratives because of that length of time. But it
Hmm.
does fundamentally ask the question like, what do you do after the empire falls, and how
Hmm.
do you
Okay.
rebuild it? Now, in
Yeah.
this case, it's not an empire that's been overthrown. It's again like based on the Roman Empire. It's an empire that decays to the
Yeah.
point of kind of like tearing itself apart,
Right.
or just like fundamentally like not working anymore as a government body.
Hmm. I can see that. For me, I think the one that I think of most, and this is to me a glaring example of the danger, not necessarily of how to do it right, but is Dune. Um, and we in movies have only ever seen the story always ends with Paul, destroying the Fremen, and sometimes that's treated just as
Wait,
sorry,
what?
no, but leading the Fremen to
Okay.
destroy the Emperor and the
Yeah,
Harkonnen,
yeah,
and liberating Dune. And that is sometimes seen as, oh, this is great, and the good guys have won and the story's over. But Frank Herbert's made very clear, and I think this most recent movie helps make clear, and the books absolutely make clear, that he is very much of the idea of, when you create a messianic leader who can lead a fight to overthrow oppression, the chance of that becoming an oppressive group themselves isn't, and leading to like fascism and religious tyranny or any of those things, is very high. And in the books, absolutely, forgive me, spoilers for 70-year-old books by now. Um, Paul leads a religious, ethno. Paul winds up leading a religious holy war, and
Mm.
wiping out billions of people in these horrible ways and creating these horrible systems. Um, and I think it's very much because of the kind of like that. Anytime a leader gets to the point of, when it's the cult of, I think a lot of his point is about the cult of personality. When it's no longer about, we believe in this cause, and so this leader will lead us to the cause, but it becomes instead, we believe in this leader, so we will go for any cause or direction the leader leads us in. That's when it becomes really a problem. And to me, I think that's a story I'd love to see more of, is these stories of a charismatic leader who, like, whips up a nation or a group or people to rise up in rebellion, but still also really tries to not become that, everyone will be fanatically following me no matter what I do.
Yeah, I mean that goes back to a previous discussion we had about George Washington giving up the
Hmm.
presidency after 2 terms.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
he was still very popular from all historical accounts,
Yeah.
and could have run for a third term.
And even before that, I mean, people wanted to make him king instead of president. And
Yeah.
originally there was questions about like, what should we call the president? And should it be Your Excellency or Your Highness or something like that? And again,
And that's where, like, that's a historical example, but from a story, like fictional storytelling example, it takes like a very interesting and often different character to be able to pull something like that off.
mm-hmm.
And that's where I think Star Wars is going. Maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know where Star Wars is going with Mon Mothma, like post Empire Mon Mothma.
Right. Yeah, it's a hard thing because we know that whatever happened eventually fails. That, to some extent and it may be because they tried to go too far the other way, that they were too lenient, and so didn't see the empire building back up, or that they just they didn't do enough to fight corruption or whatever that's going to be. Yeah, I think there's some great stories to be told there. I'm looking forward to seeing more of those kind of things happen, both in those worlds, but also in, I think, just so many of the other fictional worlds that we like. I'd say actually one other example I think that does a good job of this is Star Trek, where both within the Klingon Empire and then later within the Cardassian Empire, you see what happens after a more dictator type falls. Like Worf takes down Gowron, and so everyone wants to make him the next emperor, but instead he kind of steps aside and tries to bring in someone else who will rule. It's still an empire and an emperor, but less autocratically, and and same kind of things with the Cardassians. I don't think it ever becomes a democracy necessarily, but interesting ways of looking at the stories.
The Klingon Empire, like here I go into my political rants about fiction.
Mm-hmm.
The Klingon Empire is not an empire, fundamentally. They, for the longest time, like, they didn't have an emperor.
Yeah.
It wasn't until TNG, when the resurrected Kahless comes back, they install him as a figurehead emperor, but Gowron still has the power as chancellor. So the highest office is chancellor, but it's not elected, but it is selected.
Right.
It might be for life or until death, because that's how Klingons are, but it's weird.
Which is, I mean, like, there are historical models for that. 19th century Germany was not a democracy by any means, but it was also not a, autocratic monarchy. There was a council of, nobles and the like, and they had some degree of picking, and that, so that Bismarck had to win, the choice of that high council and stuff like that. I think it's something there.
Yeah, but it was still an empire, right? There was still an emperor, but again, like, similar, like, figurehead. I think at a certain point, like an industrialized nation, one single person is no longer able to, like, rule everything per se.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what happened with some of these empires.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. Like, Bismarck was chancellor.
Right. And I know that, like, in Germany, it varied. So, like, under Bismarck, he was able to really boss around the emperors, and then by Wilhelm II comes along, I think he specifically said, "I don't ever want a Bismarck as my chancellor," and he had more power again. So yeah, it's complicated. Well, this has been a great discussion, Riki. As always, there's so much more we could talk about. But is there any other last things you want to highlight?
I don't know if it's appropriate, but I want to go back to what you said about, like, romantic movies, and I don't believe that the happily ever after part is that interesting, which is why the movie ends and why we don't get sequels, right? Because it's similar to what we're talking about in these battle fictions. Like, the battle is the interesting part.
Let's actually, because I think that's such an interesting topic, let's hold that and make that our member content. We'll start to get into that. So, all right, because you're taking out, like, I was like, if you have one last comment, go for it. But this is gonna be a whole new topic. So anyway, as always, thank you all so much for being a part of this. Please Please become members. Please send in your feedback. All of that, all that's in the show notes. Most importantly, though, I really hope you enjoyed listening to this. Have a good day. We have spoken. All right, now we're going to give it a break, and then we'll come back. All right, so Riki doesn't think people in love are interesting. Get more.
That's not what
I know
I
that's not
said.
just that. I know. I'm just teasing you.
I'm saying that if like the superhero genre, if the interesting thing is conflict, right, the battle between good and evil, then in love stories,
Mhm.
it's still similar. Like conflict in like romances is the will they, won't they, the until they get to the point of
Right.
consummating the relationship or getting married or whatever, whatever the end is for that story. Like
Mhm.
so once they're together, you have to tell a different story. And I think there have been there was some movie that got a sequel after the
Mm.
the love happened, and it was
Mhm.
just like them married, and it was still a good movie, but it was fundamentally different because it wasn't about the
Mm.
two of them falling in love or being in love or whatnot. It was like became a family, making a family movie.
I have some memories of that. The one that I think of is The Big Sick, which is a great movie with a Indian American comedian whose name I can't remember. But it's a romantic comedy, but they get married within like a third of the movie, and then the rest of the movie is them dealing with their marriage, and particularly her getting quite sick. And they marketed, they really intentionally wanted it to be a like a rom-com that doesn't end when they get together. And I
Okay. Well, the Big Sick was Kumail Nanjiani,
thank you.
who got swole for the Eternals. And
Yes,
it's
that's
probably
right.
still swole. But it's fundamentally like I love that movie too.
It's really good.
And it's based on his real life and his real
Right.
life marriage. But I thought it was about them getting together. Like at the end of the movie ends with them getting together, I thought. It's told kind of in a How I Met Your Mother, like we understand that they're together way, maybe was the
I
narrative.
think so. Yeah, maybe I'm forgetting it.
But the
Um,
conflict, the central, I say conflict, but the central drama of the movie was still like a how will they get together? Because I don't think there's really like that many high profile romance movies where people don't get together.
hmm.
The one I can think of is The Breakup. It's a fascinating movie. It's like
Hmm.
very mediocre in just in terms of like
Right.
general movie making and stuff, but I'm fascinated by it because it's about a breakup and it's not about people
Hmm.
getting together. And
I.
I like it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It has grown on me more and more over the years, and I just because it was such a, I guess, a risk. Like they took a
Yeah.
swing with it in terms of going against the grain of standard comedies.
I'd be very curious to see that. I don't. It doesn't strike a bell for me right now, but I would love to see that. I would say.
It was Vince Vaughn and Jennifer Aniston, so it's like a very
Okay.
good cast as well,
Okay.
and worth it in that regard.
Sure. Yeah, I'll definitely check it out. The ones that come to me are, and I haven't seen them. I just know something about them. The Before Sunset, the Before Sunrise, and I think the next one was like Before Sunset. And then after, I don't know. I forget the exact names.
Oh, Ethan Hawke.
Yeah, exactly. And my understanding is that it's about people who have these kind of like whirlwind romance on a train, but then decide to part, and then they get back together, and then etc. And I guess you're right that I guess here's kind of my point is that I think there is. I think I don't believe that you have to have that kind of a will they won't they conflict. I think that's the easiest thing to do. I think it's very much the low hanging fruit, and the next level of fruit is much higher up. But I I think that I'm kind of bored of those stories because we get them all the time, and because I think I think there is kind of an impression a lot that we get that once you have your first kiss or you're like your first kiss after the bad fight, everything's going to be okay again. And it's not how life is. That's not how relationships are. One philosophy that I hear a lot in kind of relationship therapy and stuff, and that I certainly try to use with my partners that I think is really helpful is how do you move a relationship conflict from you against me to you and me against the problem, and like the problem is that we have different wants here, but instead of it being let's fight about that, it's like how can we together find something that meets both of our needs. And again, maybe in everything, I just want discussion instead of conflict as the basis of my movies. And maybe I just think that you can have some storytelling that's not mirrored in conflict. But I do think that there's some storytelling that we could do that isn't just about, will they, won't they? It's about like what kind of quality relationship are they going to have together? I don't know. Maybe I'm too pie in the sky.
I just don't think that's interesting. I mean, you say like this is like these movies aren't real life. And I would be like, yeah, these movies aren't real life.
Yeah.
The same way that like superhero movies aren't real life. So there's like a central conceit that we have to accept about genres or about certain properties. And then we go for the ride on them. And then it's about whether the story is well written and makes you believe what's going on, and whether it's well acted. So like I'll tell you, one of my absolute favorite movies of all time is You've Got Mail. And the Tom Hanks character is an asshole. Absolutely, like just a villain in terms of the actions he takes in this movie, like lying, gaslighting, like all this kind of stuff, right? But it's well written, and more importantly, it's well acted, and Tom Hanks is a delight. And he makes me cry every time. It's like I'm so mad at this character, but like I can't help it. Like it's so good. And
that's fair. And
that's partly like just Tom Hanks is a generationally amazing actor, I think.
Right.
And that's why I like these movies. Like I think I've gotten to the point where I understand the conceit, and there are some rom-coms that I'm like over it.
Yeah.
And like I don't need to watch that again because it doesn't meet the bar for me. And I think people can disagree on this. Like for me, You've Got Mail still like is the gold standard of this type of movie that should not work in real life, but the way that it is constructed and acted does work in the movie, and I'm okay with that.
That's fair. And I do love, escapist fantasy. I mean, I think that's always great. And I get, and I love, and I'm not saying I don't want more rom-coms. I love rom-coms. I want lots more of them.
They have to change, or like some of them have changed. Like the genre has evolved, and I think it still needs to evolve a little bit more from where it is.
I guess part of where I come from though on this is, and maybe this is a different genre, but I think there's ways to learn from it. One of the relationships that I think by a lot of kind of TV critics is often joked about is like the holy grail of like a good portrayal of a realistic marriage is the relationship between Coach Taylor and his wife on the TV show Friday Night Lights. It's one of my absolute favorite TV shows. A lot of people don't like it. It's about sports, and that's totally fine if it's not your thing. But I think it's much deeper than I think a lot of people give it credit for. But the portrayal of their marriage is really wonderful because they have conflicts. They fight with each other. They're cute with each other. They're romantic with each other. They're sexy with each other. There's never really a point where anyone thinks they're going to break up. There's never really a point where they're in a utter crisis of the kind that so often is created as a cliffhanger for a movie or a TV show or something like that. But they definitely have conflict throughout it, and they work through it. And yes, there's so much else in the story, of course, but it's fascinating to watch, and it makes for very entertaining because you care about these people and you root for them. And like there are situations created where you're kind of like, I don't think either one of these people is wrong, but I see how they're at odds with each other. And I hate that because I love them both and I want them to be happy together. So yeah, I think rom-coms are great. I think there's more to be done in the world of romantic comedy that isn't just will they, won't they, or, some version of that. That's all.
I think we could probably have like a further discussion on this. we could branch off a little bit from our usual superhero type discussions,
Sure.
because I think it's fundamentally interesting in the same way that the superhero discussions are, where we are talking about fiction,
Mhm.
but trying to relate to real life things
Yeah.
oftentimes. And I mean, relationships, like romantic relationships, are fundamental to the human experience.
Yeah.
And to some degree, well, to every degree, I think, more relatable than like punching other people or like
Right.
shooting lasers from your
And
robot. It's
and there are
so,
there are people who are aromantic, but yeah, I think in the overwhelming
yeah,
majority
sure.
of cases, you're definitely true. And
No,
yeah,
absolutely.
I think it's gonna make it great for the podcast. I think I know some friends who are rom-com writers or real kind of students of the genre
Oh,
who I think would make great guests. Um, especially because, and I don't think I think you and I are living proof that this doesn't have to be true, but rom-coms are very perceived to be very gendered. And on the one hand, while having two guys talk about that, I think was really interesting. It would also be good to like bring in some other perspectives there. So yeah. So audience, if you've got rom-coms you want to talk about, send them in. We will say that in this day and age, falling in love is a superheroic act. So we're gonna call it a superhero action, and we're gonna talk about the ethics of it sometime soon on Superhero Ethics. Thank you so much, Riki. Thank you to our members. You make this all possible. We have spoken. All right, we're out.